This is Gaming Through the Ages, and today we'll be discussing Mizzurna Falls for the PlayStation 1. This game came as some surprise as it's a 3D open-world game released in December of 1998. That's a year before Shenmue's original Japanese release, and nearly 3 years before the release of Grand Theft Auto 3, two games often considered pioneering of the genre. Due to my proclivity for exploring both the Japanese language and old video games, I sometimes find myself immersed in the world of fan translations and localizations, which is where Mizzurna Falls came to my attention. Despite there being a translated version of the game's script for years, a translated patch of the game did not exist until 2019, where an incomplete patch briefly surfaced. The original programmer who released their work quickly condemned its release, as they never intended it be made available as an incomplete patch, but rather wanted their work to be completed before being released as a playable version. The footage being shown here is the original Japanese complete version of the game, and I do not recommend playing the unfinished patch, especially because supposedly there is a skilled programmer who has now begun working on finishing the original programmer's work. There is a way to enjoy the narrative of the game currently, however. A YouTuber by the channel name of Resident Evie translated the entire game in a playthrough, and I will link to their channel in the video description for anyone interested. As for my own interest in the game, it was piqued not only by its connection to open-world game development, but because I kept hearing it compared to the series Twin Peaks, which happens to be one of my favorite television series of all time. After playing through the game, I would say it's undeniable that the game is mimicking Twin Peaks, from plot beats to characters and even motivations. While I wouldn't go so far as to call the game plagiaristic, I have no doubt some would call it that. One of the major reasons to play this game is for the narrative, and I would rather not spoil any elements of either the game's plot or that of Twin Peaks, so I will simply say they are both small-town murder mysteries with a touch of the supernatural, where the normalcy and absurdity of everyday life work in both tandem and juxtaposition, and the interplay between good and evil is explored. These stories are slow burns by nature, but I find them deeply compelling, and I highly recommend that anyone intrigued by the notion give them some time and attention. You may well find yourself completely entranced, as so many others, myself included, once were. The gameplay of Mizzurna Falls is almost entirely exploratory. You play as Matthew, exploring the town by foot or car, talking to other characters, sometimes arriving on time for events to play out, and trying to unearth the mystery at the core of the narrative. My biggest criticism of the game takes place at its immediate beginning. The player is given control over Matthew during the prologue of the game, where they are able to gain their bearings and figure out the game's controls. If the player hits start during the intro segment, the prologue is skipped entirely, the game's countdown timer begins, and the player may very well have no idea that they have skipped the entire prologue, as they simply appear in the town's police station. It's very likely, almost expected, that a player would do this during a part of the game where it's natural to be trying out the functions of the different buttons on the controller. A simple menu pop-up asking the player if they are sure they want to skip past the prologue would have completely resolved this issue. Regardless, after the player has finished the prologue section of the game and is introduced to the mystery and some of the characters, they are given control of Matthew inside the police station and the true game begins. This is where a clock starts ticking, and depending on the time taken to complete the game and whether Matthew witnesses certain events at the correct times, the narrative of the game can lead to multiple endings with varying degrees of accomplishment, in part because witnessing certain events allows other events to unlock. This is the trickiest part of the game, as events can overlap, and it doesn't seem like all the mechanics of this gameplay style were completely hammered out at this time, since event triggers could be a little bit buggy. It can be exceptionally difficult to witness events in the intended manner on a first playthrough, as time is fairly restrictive, and the player needs to have a solid grasp of where to go and when in order to make it successfully down the path towards the best ending. As this seems in direct contrast to the game's slow atmosphere and seemingly intentional focus on exploration, I can only guess the game was intended to be played at multiple times, which is the way I played the game, and I think it's the best way to get the most out of Mizzurna Falls. That is to say, it's the best way to get the most out of Mizzurna Falls once a complete fan translation patch is eventually released. Currently, the game's language barrier is much too high for someone to get a very satisfying experience without being able to read Japanese at a decent level. I do believe that someone with the programming know-how will eventually complete the fan translation patch, because this game has a strong cult following for a reason, and I do believe that following will increase over time. Mizzurna Falls isn't for everyone. Cult classics don't really tend to be, but to the right person with the right interests, this game can be a very special experience. If any of this has piqued your curiosity, I highly recommend keeping Mizzurna Falls and the progress of its patch on your radar.